What's up, everyone? Today we're ranking the hardest instruments to learn and to master. Now, before everyone heads to the comments, here's how I'm going to judge these instruments. I'm looking at 6 different things. 1. Tone production. How difficult is it to make a good sound? 2nd, intonation. How hard is it to consistently play in tune? 3rd, technique. This includes fingerings, bowings, articulation, coordination, and speed. Number 4, physical demands. This includes air support, embouchure, endurance, flexibility, and strength. 5th one, the learning curve. How long does it take before you become a solid player? Although I do have to say, for each one of these instruments, you do have to practice a lot, and I mean a lot, to become a good player, like anything you would do in life. So, the following is my opinion based on the following factors. So if you disagree, and I know some of you will, let me know where you would move each instrument. Let's jump into it. To start off the list, I'm going to be ranking the S tier. I am just going to start with a French horn, which I'm going to place here. The instrument is notorious for being one of the hardest in the orchestra. For one, there is a very tiny margin for error. The French horn has one of the smallest mouthpieces of any brass instrument, so even one tiny change in lip position can send you to the wrong note. On the French horn, the notes are extremely close together. Because of the horn's long tubing, many notes share similar fingerings. Players heavily rely on their ears and embouchure to hit the correct partial. In addition, intonation is difficult. Keeping the instrument in tune is a constant challenge, especially in the upper register. French horn players also require endurance, maintaining a strong embouchure for long passages, which is physically demanding. On top of that, the French horn also plays a high-pressure orchestra role, which means that French horns often have exposed solos where every mistake is obvious. So, next instrument that we're going to rank is the oboe. That also belongs in the S tier. The double reed alone makes this instrument difficult. Producing a good sound requires extremely precise air pressure and embouchure. Another thing that makes it difficult is that professionals spend hours adjusting or even crafting reeds because each one dramatically changes how the instrument plays. You also need very high breath resistance to play the oboe. Small changes in embouchure can noticeably affect tuning. Finally, there are demanding fingerings techniques on the oboe. The keywork is complex, and many notes have awkward alternate fingerings. And rounding out the S tier would be the violin. Unlike a guitar, there are no frets to guide your fingers, so every note has to be placed perfectly by ear. A millimeter off is enough to sound out of tune, and I can attest for that because I am learning how to play the violin and keep misplacing my fingers. Bow control is an art by itself as well, and advanced violin music is some of the most technically demanding ever written. Producing a beautiful tone also depends on bow speed, pressure, and angle, as well as contact point, all at the same time. It takes years just to develop a consistently beautiful sound. On top of worrying about your bowing hand, you also have to worry about the hand holding the actual violin, as both hands do completely different jobs. The left hand controls pitch on the actual instrument, while the right hand controls tone and rhythm, requiring intense coordination on the bow. The violin also requires advanced techniques that are incredibly demanding. Vibrato, shifting, double stops, harmonics, and fast passages all have a steep learning curve, and could take weeks if not months to learn. Lastly, mistakes are very noticeable. Even beginners can sound scratchy or out of tune until they have developed proper technique. Now, onto our A tier. So the bassoon starts off our A tier. Bassoon is another double reed instrument. Like the oboe, bassoonists have to deal with reeds that can make or break their performance. In addition to the pressure coming from the double reed, there is also the complex fingering systems that you have to worry about. There are many keys, awkward stretches, and multiple fingerings for the same note. In general, the bassoon is a larger instrument to manage. Coordinating fingering movements across such a long instrument, as well as holding it for extended periods of time, takes practice. Lastly, there is a wide range. Players are expected to move smoothly between deep, resonant notes to surprisingly high passages. Why is the bassoon not an S tier if it's so hard then? Well, reed making is still a major hurdle. The bassoon generally has a larger margin for error than the oboe, and doesn't demand quite the same level of precision in every note. So the cello also belongs in A tier. The cello is another instrument with no frets. Just like the violin, every note must be placed accurately, otherwise the note itself will completely be different. In addition, the bow technique is crucial. Producing a rich, consistent sound requires years of practice, just like the violin. However, with a larger instrument comes larger shifts. Moving between positions on the long fingerboard demands precision. There is also more space in between notes compared to the violin. Lastly, there is a lot of physical coordination. Players manage bowing, shifting, posture, and vibrato simultaneously. If the cello is so similar to the violin, then why is it not on the S tier with the violins? Well, the cello's playing position is generally more aerodynamic than the violin's, and its larger finger spacing can make intonation a bit more approachable, especially early on. The next is the trombone, which also goes in the A tier. Since there are no valves, every note depends on precise slide placement. Because of that, you need an excellent ear. There are no fixed notes. You have to find them yourself if you hear it is wrong. You must also have slide coordination or hand-eye coordination. Fast passages require precise, rapid slide movements while you read music. The air support matters a lot as well, as tone quality depends heavily on breath control. So why is it not on S tier? So the slide gives players continuous control over pitch, making corrections easier than on the French horn, whose partials are much less forgiving. So the next instrument on our list is the flute. So the flute also belongs in the A tier and is often underestimated. It is often to produce a good sound at first. Beginners often struggle just to make the instrument speak, let alone to make a good sound. When I was first learning how to play the flute, it took me 3 months just to make a sound out of it. The embouchure is delicate. Small changes affect tone, pitch, and response. The breath control is also demanding. Much of your air never enters the instrument, so efficient breathing is essential. And lastly, the flute requires fast technique. Advanced flute music often features incredibly quick finger work, and I am still even working on this one. So the piccolo is right next to the flute. The first reason being that the tiny mistakes become huge. Because it's so small, even slight errors in the embouchure or air support are magnified. There is also a very high register. High notes require exceptional control. Intonation is notoriously tricky as well. Keeping the instrument in tune takes constant adjustment. There are also a lot of exposed orchestral parts. The piccolo often cuts through the entire ensemble. Although as a flute player, no offense to the piccolo players in the crowd, I do have to say that most piccolo players go from the flute to the piccolo, so starting piccolo is a lot easier as most of the fingerings and embouchure also transfers over. And finally, to round out the A tier is the harp. One of the reasons it is hard is because both hands work independently, similar to the piano, but with a completely different technique. There are also 7 pedals that change each and every note. Players consistently move their feet while reading music and using both hands. In addition, there is also a lot of complex coordination. You're essentially playing 3 separate systems at once: left hand, right hand, and pedals. Lastly, it is physically demanding. Large reaches and constant movement require endurance. So why is it not in the S tier then if it's so hard? Well, the strings are laid out visually and physically in a very logical way, and once pedal technique is mastered, then the instrument offers a relatively predictable playing experience compared with most unforgiving instruments. So, starting off for B tier is the clarinet section. So, the clarinet is a single reed instrument, and single reed instruments are generally easier to manage than the double reeds. In addition, there is a wide range with a noticeable break between registers that's tricky to master. There is also a very fast finger technique, and you need a very good breath support for a beautiful tone. The reason being of why this is not in the A tier is that it's much more forgiving than the oboe or the bassoon, and beginners can usually make a decent sound relatively quickly. And I do have to say, during instrument tryouts, when I was playing clarinet, I was able to make a sound on the first try, so keep that in mind. The next on our list is the bass clarinet, also in the B tier. So it shares a lot of the clarinet's complex fingerings, but it is the larger size, obviously, so it requires more air and is more physically demanding. And as well as the fingering stretches are much wider compared to the normal clarinet, and producing a rich resonant tone can take a lot of practice. So the reason why it's not A tier is because despite its size, it's generally easier to control than the bassoon or contrabassoon because of its single reed and much more forgiving response. So the next instrument is the trumpet, also in B tier. The trumpet has a small mouthpiece that requires excellent embouchure strength, and the high notes are physically demanding as you need a lot of air support and excellent lip control, and endurance is also a major challenge in playing the trumpet, as well as precision attacks that are essential and crucial to playing the instrument. So the reason being and why this instrument is not A tier is that its valve simply note selections compared to the trombone, and the harmonic series is less unforgiving than the French horn. So the next instrument on our list is the viola, which also goes in the B tier. And it has the same fretless challenges as the violin and the cello, and which means that even if you're a millimeter off, your note will sound wrong. And this instrument is slightly larger than the violin, which means wider finger spacings. And their rich tone requires a solid bow technique, and a lot of the things are similar to the violin. But you may be wondering, why is it not an A tier? Well, the repertoire is usually less technically extreme than the violins and slightly lower pitches and makes intonation a bit more forgiving than the violin, which makes it not as hard. So the double basses are also here as well. And the double basses, they are a huge instrument. You need to play them standing up. And they have long stretches between notes, and intonation is still difficult on the double bass, and the bowing also takes time to master and is slightly different than the violin or the viola because you are holding your instrument with a violin and viola versus the double bass, which you are not holding that instrument while you are playing. And it is also a lot more physically demanding because it is a lot bigger than the other string instruments and instruments out there in general. And the reason why it is not an A tier is because that the lower register is generally more forgiving for pitch accuracy than violin or cello. So the English horn also belongs in the B tier. It's closely related to the oboe, so the double reed challenges are still present, and it requires breath support as well, in addition to intonation, which also needs your attention. And the reason why it's not an A tier is because most English horn players already know how to play the oboe, making it more of a specialized extension than a completely new challenge. So although it is also very difficult, most of the players already start out with a basic oboe knowledge or transferred from oboe, so most players already know how to play somewhat. And the contrabassoon also earns the B tier. The contrabassoon is an enormous instrument, and it requires a huge amount of air, and the double reed issue still remains, as well as the finger work. The finger work is a lot slower due to its size, and you may be wondering, why is it not an A tier? Well, the reason being that the lower range, as mentioned before, is relatively forgiving, and the technical demands are generally less virtuosic than bassoon. And the next instrument is the timpani. And I know that some people consider this a percussion instrument, but I'm just gonna leave it as its own instrument for now. And when you're on the timpani, you consistently need to tune while you're performing and also you're the only percussionist who has to tune the instrument in the middle of the piece, which makes it more challenging. And then you need excellent pitch recognition, as well as four-limb control and precise stick control, because you need to hit the right note, the right space, and everything. So why is it not A tier? Well, the technical vocabulary is smaller than on many melodic instruments, even though tuning is uniquely challenging. So now we're going to start with the C tier, and we will start with the alto sax or alto saxophone. One reason so many students begin on alto is that it's relatively easy to produce a good sound or tone. The fingering system is also very logical, but advanced classical and jazz playing still requires tremendous skill. The reason why it's not higher is because it's one of the most beginner-friendly woodwinds out there. And that leads me to the next instrument, the tenor sax, which is also in the saxophone family, and it is very similar to the alto sax, and it requires much more air and has a larger instrument to manage, but the learning curve is still fairly approachable compared to many orchestral instruments, and a lot of the fingerings from the alto sax will carry over to the tenor sax. So the next instrument on our list is the soprano sax. The soprano sax is definitely the hardest member of the saxophone family. Its intonation is much less forgiving than the alto or tenor, and even small embouchure changes can throw notes out of tune. It also has a higher register that can expose many more mistakes, and many experienced saxophonists consider it an entirely different challenge. So why, you may ask, is it not in B tier? Well, the fingering system remains one of the easiest among woodwinds, and even if pitch control is more demanding. To round out the saxophone family is the baritone sax, also in C. The size and the weight make it physically demanding, but the larger mouthpiece helps make tone production relatively approachable. However, since it's bigger, it requires lots more air and a larger cue work for the fingering. So why is it not higher? As mentioned before, the saxophone family has one of the most logical key layouts, and I've seen many people switch between the saxophone family, as many of the techniques and the fingerings are very much the same. So the next instrument that comes up next is tuba, which also is in the C tier. And yes, it requires an enormous amount of air, but the large mouthpiece makes producing a sound easier than many smaller brass instruments. The technical demands increase dramatically at advanced levels, but at the beginner learning curve, it is much more forgiving, although if you keep playing, the clean articulation will take work to improve. Why did I not place it in B tier? Well, the larger mouthpiece and low register can make the notes and note production relatively forgiving. Next on our list is the bass trombone. The additional valves and larger instrument increase the challenge, but if you mastered tenor trombone or the normal trombone, the transition is manageable. Need I say more and why it's here? So the next instrument that's in C tier is the euphonium, also known as the baritone, and it has one of the friendliest embouchures in the brass family, though advanced solo repertoire still requires outstanding musicianship and technical ability. In addition, it has a smooth valve system as well as a comfortable range. A warm tone is also very easy to produce, depending on your level, of course, though. And then the next instrument, or I should say instrument family, is percussion. And I'm grouping together for this purpose snare drums, bass drums, cymbals, and accessory percussion. And the challenge comes from learning many different instruments rather than one. Great percussionists need outstanding rhythm, timing, and versatility, even if individual instruments are often easier to begin. You also need strong rhythm counting, as well as the ability of reading multiple clefs and setups. So why is it not higher on our tier list? Many individual percussion instruments aren't technically demanding as mastering violin or oboe, though becoming a complete percussionist is a substantial challenge because of the breadth of skills involved. Now this one is going to be controversial, but piano is also in the C tier, and piano is one of the hardest instruments to truly master. Concert pianists are incredibly good musicians and can play great pieces. But if we're talking about learning an instrument from scratch, piano is one of the easiest places to begin producing a note and is as simple as pressing a key. In addition, notes are laid out visually, as well as the piano being, simply put, an excellent beginner. Like a beginner or introduction to the musical family. So as a piano player myself, beginning the piano wasn't too hard to play songs and mastered some of the easier songs that I enjoyed playing. And there are also a lot of different arrangements of a song you like, and they'll basically customize to the level that you're at. So you can just play that as well. And it was also a great tool to help me visualize where the notes were on the actual keyboard and where they were when I started playing the flute and the violin this summer. So why is it not higher? The fundamentals are relatively accessible compared to many orchestral instruments. And finally, Celestia. Since it's a keyboard-based instrument, much of the basic techniques transfer from piano, and the repertoire generally isn't as demanding as much as the other orchestral instruments. And why is it not higher? Well, anyone who plays piano already has most of the required skills. And now for the D tier. And honestly, I don't think any of the standard orchestral instruments belong in D tier. If I were to include beginner instruments just for fun, I would put the recorder here, because it's designed to help new musicians learn the basics of reading music, rhythm, and breath control. It is also really easy to make a sound and is easy to make a sound out of. It's also lightweight and easy to carry around, as well as inexpensive. So that's my list. In S tier we have French horn, oboe, violin. In A tier we have bassoon, cello, trombone, flute, piccolo, harp. In the B tier we have clarinet, bass clarinet, trumpet, viola, double bass, English horn, contrabassoon, and timpani. In C tier we have the saxophone family, which include alto sax, tenor sax, soprano sax, bari sax, as well as tuba, bass trombone, euphonium, percussion, piano, and celesta. And then in the D tier, although this is not a standard orchestra instrument, we have the recorder. Now, I know there are going to be some strong opinions about this tier list. So, which instrument should be in S tier? which instrument should be in D tier or any of the other tiers. Which ones did I rank too low? Which ones did I rank too high? And if you play one of these instruments, tell me where you would put it and why. Let me know in the comments below. If you enjoyed this video, leave a like and subscribe if you're new, and I'll see you in the next one. Later.